Hi, thank you for clicking on this video. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be making something with clay and telling you all about the Boston molasses disaster. So let's get started. On January 16th, 1919, the headline of the Boston Post read, "Huge molasses tank explodes in North End. 11 dead, 50 hurt." So the story of the Boston molasses disaster, also known as the Great Molasses Flood, begins in 1915 in the North End of Boston, Massachusetts. At this time, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company was manufacturing ethanol, which is made by fermenting molasses. And ethanol was used to make explosives, as well as being the active ingredient in alcoholic beverages. So at this time, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, called the Purity Distilling Company of Boston, was focusing on the production of explosives for the war. The company had a distilling plant, but they quickly realized that they needed an additional construction to store molasses, which was the main ingredient in their production. Molasses is a byproduct of refining cane sugar and is dark, thick, and sweet with an earthy flavor. Molasses is commonly used in cooking and baking as a sweetener, but has other uses, including as animal feed and for the production of several types of consumable alcoholic beverages. Molasses was a very common household sweetener since it was cheaper than usual refined sugar. In the case of the Purity Distilling Company, one of the first mistakes made was that they put their accountant in charge of the design of the storage tank. Although he held no architectural or engineering experience, planning was quickly underway. The location chosen for the storage tank was in the north end of Boston on Industrial Street, very close to the harbor, in order to ease the transport of the incoming shipments of molasses from the boats to the storage tank. The tank was to be constructed using 7 large curved steel plates, which were to be fastened together with rivets. The tank was to be built to a looming 50 feet tall and 80 feet wide, and intended to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. This was huge, but since it was considered a storage receptacle and not exactly a building, it didn't have to adhere to any of the building codes at the time. However, when the shipment of steel plates arrived, it was discovered that they were only half as thick as expected. This was certainly a red flag, and several people involved in the project protested. But in the end, it was decided to just move on and put their safety concerns aside. The first shipment of molasses was scheduled to arrive in only 2 months, and urgency was felt, so the construction of the tank began, and it was soon erected. The first shipment of molasses came in, and the tank proved to be problematic almost immediately. Each time the tank was filled, it would creak and groan under the pressure. No safety testing had been performed, and the tank immediately began leaking. This was to the great delight of the kids in the surrounding area, who would swipe their fingers along the tank for a quick treat as they walked home from school. And the residents of the surrounding neighborhood would come by with buckets to collect the leaking molasses to use in their home baking and cooking. Although this was a funny perk to the nearby population, it was certainly a warning sign as to the structural integrity of the tank. Instead of doing anything to address the issue, the Purity Distilling Company simply decided to paint the tank brown in hopes of hiding the problem. Out of sight, out of mind, perhaps. Over the following years, the tank held a presence in the neighborhood. Each time it was filled with a new shipment of molasses, it would groan in obvious stress. Production was in full swing at this time due to the impending prohibition, which would be enforced in January 1920. This era would completely prohibit the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages. So, United States Industrial Alcohol was ramping up their production as much as possible to make use of all the molasses they had and to make as much money as they could before they would be unable to continue. In January of 1919, just about 4 years after the tank was constructed, Boston was experiencing a bit of a heat wave. Generally, winters in Boston tend to be quite chilly, but that year temperatures were hitting the upper 40s for a few days. The molasses storage tank was filled to the brim after the latest shipment had just arrived a few days earlier. When shipments arrive, the molasses is heated up, which helps to ease the transport via pipeline from the ships carrying the load to the storage tank. And because the warm new shipment that had just arrived and the warm weather, the molasses in the tank began to heat up and ferment and began to release gases and build up pressure. Generally, this was okay since there was a vent at the top of the tank, but since it was winter, the vent was actually unfortunately closed at the time, which caused the pressure to just build and build. So, on January 15th, 1919, catastrophe struck. Right around 12:30 p.m., the molasses storage tank, holding 2.3 million gallons at the time, burst open. People reported hearing a loud crashing sound and a machine gun type popping sound, which was the rivets actually bursting out of the framework of the tank. This sent a 25-foot high wave of molasses pouring out in every direction at a speed of 35 miles per hour. Everything in the path of the flood was absolutely destroyed. I mean, houses and buildings were torn off of their foundations or just crushed, and people and animals were swept away. Anything in its path just got destroyed. And it happened so quickly that no one could really do anything to prevent the disaster. When I first heard of the Boston molasses disaster, I couldn't help but laugh a little bit when I thought about a huge wave of molasses flooding down the street. I couldn't help but think that this must have been the slowest flood ever, because when I bring molasses to my mind, it conjures up an image of a super thick, slow-moving liquid. But the deeper I got into researching this situation, I had to realize the tremendous amount of potential energy that this tank held just because of its size, being 80 feet wide and 50 feet tall and holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses. It was actually a lot more dangerous than a flood with water because of how thick it was and the force that it would have as it poured down the streets. Just to give you an idea of the absolute chaos and destruction which was occurring right after the tank burst, I will read a quote from the Boston Post. Quote, "Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was. Horses died, like so many flies, on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise." End quote. Another quote from the Boston Post in the paper that was put out on January 16th, 1919, so the day after the disaster, reads, quote, "Ensnaring in its sticky flood more than 100 men, women, and children, crushing buildings, teams, automobiles, and streetcars, everything in its path. The black, reeking mass slapped against the side of buildings, footing Copp's Hill, and then swished back towards the harbor." End quote. The Boston Post also printed a quote from the chemist for the state police at the time, named W.L. Wedger, and I think this paints a really accurate and gruesome picture of the scene. It reads, quote, "Wedger finds that in a great tank of molasses so heated, there could be generated a mixture of air and gas that would be as explosive as the same amount of air and gasoline." The paper reads, quote, "that horses were blown about like chips, houses torn asunder, and the heavy section of the elevated railroad structure smashed like an eggshell, are other considerations linked with the conclusions of Mr. Wedger." End quote. After finally spreading out, the liquid settled to a depth of about 2 feet throughout the city's north end. And people quickly flocked to the scene to help out. So there were police officers, firefighters, the Red Cross, makeshift hospitals were set up nearby to attend to the many resulting injuries of this disaster. And this was a very unprecedented disaster. I mean, sure, floods had happened in the past, right? That was a disaster that, is fairly common. But for the flood to be a molasses flood, I mean, this had never happened before, and it came with its own set of challenges and difficulties. It took 4 days just to locate all of the victims, since the molasses was so sticky and dark colored, and a few of the victims actually were never able to be identified because they were so completely glazed over with molasses. And it was even more difficult because at night the temperatures would drop and the molasses would actually begin to thicken even more, making it really difficult to wade through and continue cleaning up. The efforts to clean up the city were arduous. I mean, it was really difficult because of how sticky it was. So it was decided that they would use salt water to help kind of break up the molasses and clear up the streets. So luckily the ocean was right nearby, so they would pump the salt water from the ocean, breaking up the molasses on the streets and help start to clear it out. So this made the harbor brown from the molasses for months and months. And another difficulty was that the molasses was actually being tracked all over the city by people who were either participating in the cleanup or, many people just came to see what the heck was going on because, it was a molasses flood. It was so bizarre and strange and novel. This has never happened before. So all of these people who came actually tracked the molasses all over and spread out the stickiness even farther than the initial disaster ever could. Everything that anyone touched was sticky. So, telephone booths, seats on the subway, and from everyone's shoes, the ground everywhere was sticky. This disaster resulted in the first major class action lawsuit in America. After the flood, the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Corporation attempted to blame the disaster on anarchists, suggesting that the tank had been blown up with explosives. But this was quickly disproven, and 119 of the victims opened lawsuits for damages. But these all ended up being combined into one lawsuit that lasted for years. And in the end, it was ruled that the Great Molasses Flood was due to the shoddy construction of the storage tank, and some other factors as well, such as the warm weather and the fact that the tank had just been topped off with a new shipment. But obviously, this all could have been avoided if the tank had been built up to a standard of safety. United States Industrial Alcohol Company did not attempt to rebuild the storage tank. This tragedy brought forth many safety regulations in buildings from that point on, including measures such as making sure that licensed architects signed off on projects and that there were civil engineers on work sites, ensuring that building projects were coming along safely. Currently, the site where the Molasses tank once stood is now a city-owned recreational complex, which has a playground and a baseball field. And there's a small plaque at the entrance of the park, which commemorates the disaster. One of the most fascinating bits of information that I came across while doing my research was that the smell of molasses remained in Boston for years and years after the disaster. According to the journalist Edwards Park, quote, "The smell of molasses remained for decades a distinctive, unmistakable atmosphere of Boston," end quote. Many sources say that even to this day, on really warm days, you can still smell that sticky, sweet, distinctive smell of molasses.